Very good evening, everybody. Welcome to RICS for the Harris debate, which was first established in 2012 in recognition of our past president, Jonathan Harris, who I'm very pleased to say is here, although I can't find you, Jonathan. There he is. So the reason it's named after Jonathan is in reflection of his outstanding contribution to lifelong learning in the profession. And great to have you here, and obviously great to have so many people here this evening. And I'm very glad that the Harris debate is making a return following a hiatus during the COVID years. I'm pleased to say this evening's session is being live streamed as well as here in the building. And I understand that we have nearly 500 people joining us, not just from the UK, but from all around the world, which is just incredible, really. So no pressure to the panel. You're being watched from as far afield as Australia. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to everybody who's joining us. This evening's, this annual event is a real highlight on our calendar, and as ever, I'm sure we're going to have a really thought-provoking evening discussion. And this is a chance really to look at key ethical issues that are shaping the sector, and we're very lucky to have an esteemed panel of experts this evening to explore dynamics of change resulting from the drive to a greener built environment, the options, the challenges, their opportunities. And this evening, and I think, it is a bit hot in here, and I think, given this evening feels like a balmy summer's evening in the middle of October. I don't know about you, but personally I've sort of had moments where I've found that rather alarming. And I think for me, it is a reminder that the need to adapt and make fundamental change to our way of life, our way of business, is non-negotiable. But that said, land, built assets are the stage upon which we live, we work, and we play, and they pose very particular challenges. They're a major store of economic value, roughly 68% of global wealth being embodied in real estate. They are highly impactful to the environment, with around about 40% of carbon emissions being estimated as coming from built environment. And of course, they are illiquid and costly to adapt. So decarbonising UK housing alone was estimated to cost into the trillions. So it's the speed and the manner of change that profoundly affects and is in turn affected by the state of our economy and our consequent ability to invest and to adapt. So there's a circular link between those things. And recent political announcements reflect the complex challenge faced by leaders in squaring the pace of change with the need to maintain the economy and, of course, importantly, to carry popular opinion with change. But there is not just a challenge, there's an opportunity. Climate Change Coalition estimates that 725,000 new jobs can be created by the drive to net zero by 2030. And professional services, of course, are key in the middle of that. And areas that were new and niche specialisms are now increasingly becoming mainstream in areas such as the circular economy, carbon measurement, and many other areas. The surveying profession, which of course is tasked with the economic management of the built environment throughout its life cycle, will now be looked to lead the way and find strategies for adaptation by decision makers. And of course, I'm sure many of you know, the profession's motto is est modus in rebus, which means there is measure in all things. So consistent measurement is going to be absolutely key to strategic management and decision making. And against this backdrop, our strategy, RICS's strategy, has leadership in sustainability as a key objective, alongside strengthening trust and confidence in the profession, inspiring the next generation, and delivering excellent value to our professional members. Now, in this context, and of course for the public interest, our focus is firstly on standards and guidance, so areas you will have seen such as the whole life carbon assessment standard that we launched earlier this month, cost and carbon reporting, retrofit, land stewardship, strategic asset management, and of course helping valuers and their clients to keep pace with change. So these are all areas that we're really focused on at the moment, and just a few examples of where this profession can and must add value. Alongside that, championing data and technology-based solutions, such as the Built Environment Carbon Database, which will be launched by our partners at BCIS, working with a number of professional bodies very shortly. And importantly, making the case for government and to markets for viable strategies to transform the built environment. And hopefully you've taken a chance to see the manifesto that RICS has launched earlier this month again. So I'll just leave you with the thought that convening debates such as these are a really critical part of that leadership. They're about building consensus, building opinions, challenging ourselves. And I know that this evening's panel will help us to do just that. And I'm very pleased to be able to hand you over to Lord Bichard, who will chair tonight's debate. Lord Bichard needs no introduction, I'm sure, but is former Permanent Secretary, Chair of the National Audit Office, and now Senior Independent Governor at RICS. Thank you very much, and have a great evening.
Well, welcome to everyone here and everyone online. I'd like to say a special welcome to those in Australia, because I reckon it's about 4:30 in the morning over there. And I know the results on their sporting achievements have not been great recently, so glad to have you with us. My aim here is to stop people sprinkling stardust on the speakers. No, you weren't watching the conference speech this afternoon. Vivienne said she'd love to have stardust sprinkled upon it, so anyone who's got any in their pocket, feel free. I want to give everyone a chance to access and to have an opportunity to contribute and ask questions. The only thing I can't do is to enable those online to have a drink at the end of the session, but there we are. As Louise said, this is the 8th Harris debate, and as ever, it's great to see Jonathan here. I think Jonathan and I share, it was Keith Richards who once came to the microphone during a Rolling Stones concert and said, it's great to be here, but at my age, it's great to be anywhere. And I now know what he meant. Each of the debates over that 8-year period, and I've been privileged to chair them all, is focused on ethics in one form or another. And as I think I said last year, sadly, I don't think we can say that as a result of the debates, or indeed the public rhetoric over those 8 years, that ethical behaviour has improved. I think if I had a show of hands, most people would say it's probably got worse, which is a real worry. But that's the reason why we should carry on, and that's the reason why we are going to carry on. This year's topic explores the ethics of a green economy and asks whether it can ever be right to damage the economy to save the environment, put very simply. And to start the debate, we've got a keynote contribution from Smith Mordak. Smith is Chief Executive of the UK Green Building Council and is an award-winning architect, engineer, curator, writer, and if the word is ever justified to be used, a thought leader in this field. It's deeply worrying when you've got a CV quite as impressive as that. So Smith is going to talk about what a post-growth economy might look like for the built environment and how the RICS and its members can address the climate emergency whilst moving to a fair and sustainable economy. When Smith has finished, I'm going to ask you if there are any questions you've got, and indeed online. And I'm going to call up a panel. We thought we'd share the load. We've got an incredibly good panel. So I'm going to call them up. And when we perhaps just run out or have a pause on the questions, I'm going to ask them each to make a contribution on what they think of what Smith has said. So no pressure, Smith. It'll be fine. So without any further ado, delighted to have you here, Smith Mordak.
Okay, where's the clicky thing? Hi. Well, I have to say I didn't expect to get an email from the RICS asking me to talk about post-growth or degrowth, or at least I didn't expect it so soon, but you did. So thank you. And thank you for giving us this platform to talk about something that is really, really important and really important to me. I've been researching degrowth or post-growth, depending on how you want to frame it, for about 6 years now, since I got the gig to co-curate the Oslo Architecture Triennale in 2019. So it was in early 2017 when we proposed to explore the architecture of a degrowth economy, and they let us. But then over the next couple of years, we saw that big IPCC report, we saw XR, and we saw a kind of huge cultural shift and movement that's really changed the conversation about climate change and the interaction between climate change and the economy. And it seems to be allowing a more radical and progressive and open conversation about these things. And so here we are, even now, even here, kind of talking about these things. So I think that's really, really fantastic. I've also studied ecological economics at the University of Surrey with Tim Jackson, who wrote Prosperity Without Growth and Post-Growth, amongst many other things, including some really interesting briefing papers commissioned by the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Limits to Growth. And I'm a research fellow at the Centre of Understanding for Sustainable Prosperity at Surrey that Tim leads. Which is all to say that I really think that degrowth, post-growth is a fascinating area of study. It's still emerging in lots and lots of ways, but I'd recommend it to all of you. And just before I kind of start in earnest, I want to say that what I'm about to say is all sort of based on these last years of research. I am now Chief Exec at the UK Green Building Council, but this is not UK Green Building Council policy yet, maybe, no. So, you know, all views my own and those of the kind of the degrowth, post-growth scholars that are all contributing to this. So, yes, that's very important. And also I want to say that, oh, that's me, that's fine. This is from the Oslo Architecture Triennale, where the centre of the centrepiece of the exhibition was a brilliant library with hundreds of architects, engineers, and so on from around the world contributing to ideas of the architecture and built environment of a post-growth future. So the ultimate goal here is social and environmental justice, and we all want a fair society on a planet that supports life. And post-growth scholarship argues that the long-term social and environmental justice isn't possible without an economic system that isn't actively incentivizing the opposite, and that in many ways that's what we have at the moment. And so it's worth thinking about how we can find another way. And these are, I'm sure, quotes that you've probably all seen before, but they bear repeating. You know, the classic Albert Einstein one of definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and again, but expecting different results. Or the Audre Lorde quote, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So we really need to think about how we can do things differently. Now, before I dive in, finally, I also want to say thank you to the RICS for inviting me to talk about this, not only because it's important and close to my heart, but also because I really think there is a very special role for project managers and quantity surveyors and building surveyors in this transition to a sustainable economy. You folks, you understand risk management, change management, and the biases and assumptions that can go into systems of measurement. You really understand that finance and physical resources are interacting with each other and interlinked in really real ways that really matter. And so I really think you can be heroes in this change, seriously. Like, I know that sometimes you don't get the the glory that you deserve, but really, seriously, step up because you can really be part of this. So, yes. Right. Now, before I talk about post-growth or degrowth, I want to just zoom out and just talk about GDP and economic growth, so we know what we're talking about. So all of these are just pictures. That's it, you're out of words now, so I'm just going to say the words. So what is GDP? It's the size of the economy, essentially, within a country's borders in a specific time period, usually a year. The total value of goods and services produced, or the total value of everyone's income, or the total value of what everyone has spent. What GDP isn't, or what it doesn't measure, is the health, well-being, happiness, education, skills of the population. It doesn't measure the health of the environment. It doesn't measure levels of pollution or emissions. It doesn't measure equity or equality. It doesn't measure social justice or social progress. And so I really love that. I missed the Latin, but that there is measure in all things. I think this is why it's so essential that you are all part of this conversation, because what we measure and how we measure it is absolutely critical to what is incentivized and how we kind of know whether we're doing well. So why do we want GDP to increase each year under our current system? Well, population growth, although, of course, that applies to kind of total GDP, not necessarily GDP per person, per capita. To improve quality of life. So under our current economic system, improvements in quality of life largely come directly from sort of public resources funded by taxes or personal wealth. But as we'll talk about in a bit, this isn't the only option. But let's be realistic. While this dominates, it's economic growth that offers some people an opportunity for a better life. And we hear that the main reason that we have seen an increase in the standard of living is economic growth. But another way to think about this is that the main reason is actually shared public infrastructure. So things like water, sewage, energy infrastructure, the NHS. These things make a huge contribution, are the essential thing behind why we have better standards of living. And whether or not these are delivered via economic growth, these are things these are the things that we have to thank. And in a future economic system, they could be delivered in a variety of ways. And actually, a lot of the conversation about looking at different economic models is thinking like getting back to the source. Well, what are we really trying to achieve? And what are the different ways that we might achieve that without unintended consequences? Another reason we want GDP to increase every year currently is to avoid dealing with inequality. If everyone's a bit better off, then maybe they're less likely to revolt, even though some people are getting much better off than others. And if the economy grows more slowly than the interest rates that you can achieve on your investment, then even those with interest-bearing assets get richer while everybody else gets poorer. So we sort of currently manage that by just trying to make sure that the growth levels are higher. But that's very, very difficult to achieve, as I'm sure everybody who's ever had a savings account or a mortgage knows. Productivity growth. So as technology advances, this tends to increase the output per person in some sectors, in the sectors that benefit from technological improvements. And so to maintain that employment levels, the total number of people in work and the total number of hours worked, we need, in the face of that productivity growth, we have to make and consume more stuff. And it's really interesting to think of that consumption as also kind of the labor of delivering that economic growth. Then finally, we need economic growth currently to deal with public debt, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, and we need it to deal with private debt in terms of things like the sizes of loans effectively getting smaller as growth happens. These are all the ways that, it's not exclusivist, but these are some of the key ways that we're dependent on economic growth at the moment. But here's the kicker. What happens when under the current economic system when GDP doesn't increase? Well, unemployment increases, public spending increases, needs to increase, public debt therefore goes up, and sometimes, or often the rich get even richer by lending money to the government for a tidy return. Public services tend to get underfunded, and let's be honest, people die. People struggle to maintain their repayments, they lose their houses, they go bankrupt, and businesses go bankrupt. And also short-term scarcity thinking dominates, causing all kinds of harm, both from individuals who might lease things instead of buying them and then end up paying much more for them, businesses failing to satisfy their shareholders, so making kind of harsh decisions around, for example, redundancies or skipping on environmental measures, and public spending is diverted away from long-term projects like climate mitigation and resilience. What happens when GDP does increase? Well, as technology advances and increases productivity in some sectors, as I mentioned, then this hurts the sectors that rely on human labor. So we get this increasing divergence, and it's more and more difficult. It's more difficult to create affordable public services and human-based services. And we see this playing out in all sorts of ways, looking at the cost of healthcare, of homes, of education. So that can be a real problem. All the extra stuff that's being churned out in order to create that economic growth needs to be consumed. So there's a lot of advertising and inventive ways of getting us all to buy and use and pay more and more and more for all the stuff that's piling up. And all that extra stuff that's being churned out is causing emissions, biodiversity loss, habitat loss, pandemics, and all of that environmental nightmare that keeps us up at night. And then here's the real kicker, that the higher the GDP, the harder it is to keep that up, because the extraction of materials gets more expensive, the efficiency gains become more marginal, wage discrepancies between sectors become even more sort of economically unviable, as I mentioned. The environmental harms come back to bite us, as we sort of all hear about in lots of different ways. Because GDP is fundamentally reliant on resources, from energy, from materials, to human labor, and so there are limits. And while, yes, we can recycle more stuff, we can't recycle more than 100% of everything. We get stuck. So we work harder and harder, and we try to earn enough money to buy sillier and sillier things until we're sort of all these kind of glowing orbs of consciousness that don't need anything and become completely immaterial. It's not really a world I want to live in. So we need to look at different ways of maintaining our health and our prosperity collectively. I've painted a pretty bleak picture there, so it feels like we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. I'm saying GDP is a measure of size, not of health or happiness or resilience or sustainability, that we need GDP to grow or bad things happen, but when GDP grows, bad things also happen, and that also the higher the GDP, the slower it grows, and also that GDP can't grow forever. Well, this is where post-growth comes in. So post-growth ideas are about escaping this wicked problem, essentially, that we want to create an economy that doesn't need to grow at all costs, an economy that doesn't fall down if we don't see growth, an economy that allows us to thrive whether or not we grow. So we don't grow, so we're not stuck on the treadmill of growth, but can now sort of make decisions based on other things. There's no silver bullet here, but there are a few central ingredients. So firstly, money wouldn't rule. One of the main reasons that we're currently perpetuating economic growth is because in order to do something in the current economy, for example, build a building, you probably need to persuade someone to lend you some money on the proviso that you'll give them back more money that they gave you in the first place. Which is, one way to say, well, you need to find an investor. But the thing is, an investor is often like it's a person or an organization whose business model relies, it's not their fault, their business model relies on taking out more than they put in. That's the fundamental thing. So that's got to come from somewhere. And even impact investors, they need to show that return. So although it's absolutely possible to structure debt that's less extractive, and we'll talk about that a bit more with the panel, I hope, what we need to do to avoid a long chain of passing that cost of capital down on and on and on until that race to the bottom where it's exploiting the environment and the very low-paid labor that's paying the price. We need to find another way of aggregating resources in order to do stuff, and that could be what investment means. It's about aggregating stuff to decide together to do something that is of value, of collective value. Now, money might not rule, but it can still exist. It's absolutely, some people feel like, oh no, we're just going to not have any money then. No. We've had trade and currencies for thousands of years, but money is a handy tool for making sure that all the stuff that we have is distributed in the right ways to those that need them. So this means things like democratically controlled central banks that create money that can be spent on common infrastructure, so from education systems to sewage networks. And we can create as much money as we want. We just need to tax it back to prevent runaway inflation. And we can tax things that we don't want to happen, like polluting activities and inordinate power and inequality. It's a great idea, and we could do it today. In other words, what this means is that we can enable money to be the tool to do stuff rather than the ruler that we need to obey. And I know from every single project that I've ever worked on, like any good project, that's what it's there for. It's not about the money, really. It's about using the money to do the good thing. We could collectively acknowledge that we could democratically create money in order to use it for social projects. There's a very popular myth that governments need to raise money by taxing us. But for countries like the UK that have monetary sovereignty, i.e. control of our own money supply, we can democratically create that money first and then tax it back later in order to disincentivize undesirable behaviors. So we could democratically decide to create a bunch of money to, for example, make our built environment sustainable and resilient or build renewable energy infrastructure. And this money could then pass into the real economy, creating jobs and so on. And yes, if we just endlessly created more and more money, that would cause inflation. But we would balance it out by taxing things that we decide we collectively don't like emitting greenhouse gases. And this brings the amount of money in circulation down, so preventing that inflation. Now, obviously, it's more nuanced than that, and more nuanced than I can sort of tell you in a few minutes. And also, it's really, really important to acknowledge there are many reasons for inflation. It's not just the amount of money in the system. It's also where it is and how it's distributed and the causes for inflation. And I'm sure you all completely understand this looking at like the changes in building materials and labor and so on recently. So it's about, addressing those supply chain bottlenecks first rather than necessarily like squeezing people's disposable, not so disposable incomes in order to achieve that. The great thing about this, and Google modern monetary theory if you want to learn more about it, is that we don't need to make any sweeping economic changes to allow this. It's already how money works. It's just not the stories that we tell about the kind of public wallet, the kind of the household bill of the government. Now, if money wasn't the thing that was the key factor in decision making, if money was more a thing that kind of enabled stuff, we would need cultural apparatus that I don't think we really have to make collective decisions. So whether or not we'd have to talk to each other more, we'd have to have different ways of like agreeing what we should do with scarce resources. If you want to have a panic, which you probably don't, Google like copper shortages or something like, we need to decide, okay, where are we going to use this copper? Where are we going to use that? How much lithium actually is there? How can we make sure that it's going to the right places? Those kinds of decisions. We don't really have the collective cultural apparatus for making those decisions, but we could. Things like citizens' assemblies and other forms of direct democracy and resource sharing, there's loads and loads of research on this. And it would be human and it would be great. And do you know what? Project managers would be really brilliant at helping us to do this, so come on. Now, these ideas like sovereign money and expansive public services and democratic decision-making process are things that we can start to implement now in order to help us escape those growth dependencies. And that's what's really important. It's not that we can sort of tomorrow decide, okay, we're just going to shrink the economy and not change anything. That would be a very bad idea, and I just want to be really clear that that's not what I'm suggesting. What I'm talking about is having an expansive idea as to like, well, where do we want to get to immediately, and how can we eventually and immediately, and looking at how we can not be painting ourselves into this corner of like having to stay on this growth treadmill, no matter the cost of it, no matter the cost to people, to humans, to the environment, to our built environment, all of these things. We don't want to be beholden to growth at any cost, so we need to find ways of escaping those dependencies that I set out. And that's what, there's lots and lots of stuff in degrowth and post-growth scholarship that gives us those ideas. So I wanted to imagine that you were all a committee deciding on what to do about the big retrofit challenge. And if the tools that you had to address that challenge weren't simply, sorry, there's a squeaky floorboard I'm standing on. This must happen all the time. If the tools that you had to address that retrofit challenge weren't simply the kind of the current ones under the current economic model, but everything that we really have in our tool belt, including thinking about, okay, how can we create this money? We already create loads of money that actually ends up in inflating property prices and making a sort of housing price more difficult for people who are first-time buyers and so on, but without actually increasing the real value of those properties in terms of energy efficiency and connection to renewables and all these kinds of things. Imagine if we were doing that, and we would have things like how you'd have to work out the logistics of like, how are we going to convert how much land to grow hemp and straw for insulation? How are you going to make sure that you've got all these hubs to ensure that people can learn how to fit and maintain air source heat pumps? How are you going to make sure that people have the information that they need so that they don't like do it all wrong and then there are awful damp problems and all the health things like that? Those logistical things, that would be the stuff we would be worried about, not just like, oh, how are you going to pay for it? We would just be able to sort out the logistics and it would just remove a massive barrier. I'm not saying it'd be easy, it would just be more possible. And that's pretty great. So in summary, degrowth and post-growth are interesting because they take a look at our current economic struggles and imagine a way out. And I think that's worth exploring. I think we need to use every tool that we possibly have, at least explore every tool that we possibly have. So finally, I just want to talk a bit about how this relates to the built environment. And then I know that we're going to talk more about that with the panel. But there are, of course, ways in which the built environment is dependent on economic growth. We all know this. The property development business model is often, usually reliant on increases in land values and asset prices to satisfy property investors. And again, I'm not picking on individual humans here. It's the business model. It's collectively the system that we're in. And the way things are, the main way to justify improving the sustainability of a project is to show that it might command like a higher yield, a higher rent, a higher value or something like that. But that also makes it less affordable to the businesses or individuals without the privilege of the high profits or the high disposable income to be able to afford those things. Like, that can't be the only way that we do this. We need to find a just way to be able to distribute sustainability. We all deserve to have safe and energy efficient homes. And so we can't just do that by increasing values. It also, the risk of that is that then you're sort of shifting the problem down the chain, especially to the less regulated sectors or less regulated jurisdictions. And so we have to think about our impact on the overall system. But there are also ways in which built environment businesses perpetuate economic growth. For example, we create vehicles for financial speculation. Like, that's part of what we do. There is a huge amount of kind of economic growth dependency in wealth accumulation that happens as part of the property industry. And I think, we all know that, and it's kind of a bit gross. And the thing that I think really signifies this is, when people talk about units instead of homes and you feel like, ooh, it's like, that's because that's what you don't like. It's like, you want to create homes, right? You don't want to create units. But then, it's not all doom and gloom. There are lots of ways in which the built environment organizations are not dependent on economic growth. When we create shared public infrastructure, whether that's roads, houses, hospitals, energy infrastructure, with collective funds, whether that's public funds or cooperative funds, they don't need to rely on or perpetuate economic growth in that sense. Businesses that could provide goods and services in return for money that isn't locked into a kind of growth to service investor returns, for example, doesn't rely on or perpetuate economic growth. There are many of our business models are not inherently growth biased, but some of them are. And we just need to look at that and figure out how we can unpick it. And also, lots and lots of built environment businesses are supporting a degrowth or a post-growth transition. Some of them do know it and some of them don't know it. But things like, incorporating environmental and social impacts reporting alongside or even above financial KPIs. This goes back to your, I should keep it here, there is measuring all things and how we're measuring things. And I know we're talking loads and loads about environmental ESG and so on. And it's when those kinds of impacts are put as level with or as higher than even those financial KPIs, then we're starting to shift things already. It's not all the way, but we're starting to shift things. We're laying that groundwork. When we're collaborating as opposed to competing, and obviously, institutions, professional institutions like this are about collaboration, not about competition. To achieve that collaboration to achieve change is a really, really good way of working together. For example, joining the UKGBC. There you go, that's my only one pitch. And especially when we're working together to work out how to circulate and distribute resources in a fair way, according to needs as opposed to just according to profitability. So for example, a circular economy that is genuinely a circular economy that allows stuff to move around rather than just pile up in certain privileged areas. There are lots and lots of trends around building businesses that are looking to democratize their business models. We're seeing more and more sort of B Corps and co-ops and so on, laying the foundations for a society where we are making collective decisions better. And I think this is really important, actually, that we are organizations, that incredible and powerful piece of infrastructure. They are the people the people that you have access to, the people you know how to communicate with. Yes, for sure, we're entangled within this wider system, but that infrastructure and those people and those ways of communicating, we can think of them even as a kind of an infrastructure that can be part of the transition, a legacy infrastructure one day that we can mobilize towards this just transition to a sustainable, genuinely sustainable economic future. So those are some of my ideas. I'd love to hear your ideas and ideas of the panel. And that's it, really. I just really want to thank you for letting me talk about my hobby horse in the RICS. Thank you. Okay.
That was really thought-provoking. I'm really grateful. And I want to now invite people to ask some questions. Whilst they're thinking about that, I've also got this little machine here which will tell me all the wonderful questions we've had online, which I'll try and read.
Can I grab my tea?
Can you grab your tea? You can. I'll even pass your tea. I guess my question just to,
Thank you.
while people are thinking, it's a very practical question. I mean, your analysis of the post-growth economy is in many ways quite seductive and quite persuasive.
Great.
But that's good.
That's it, that's the end.
But I'm left with the question of how do you break into this? I mean, we had an example quite recently of a government trying to do something which was countercultural, and it didn't go well. So how do you see us breaking in to the current dominant culture to change it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's happening. I think the fact that we're having this conversation is showing that it's happening. I think since I've been looking at this for 6-7 years, the conversations have changed a lot. The acceptability of this as a topic to discuss has changed a lot, and that's incredibly hopeful. But I think it also comes down to this point of initially, let's just escape those dependencies so we can survive and thrive whether or not we grow. And then that allows us to make the decision as to whether or not we want to grow or not, rather than being stuck with it. And I think there are small things that we can do to enable that at a business scale, at a sort of sector scale, at a professional scale. And I think also we as an industry need to sort of be exploring these different ideas so that as the wider kind of cultural movement shifts, we're part of that conversation in the same way that the built environment has been sort of realised, we're a massive emitter and therefore we're part of the solution. I think we too can be part of the solution for the kind of economic changes as well.
So your approach in advising government would be, it's very important you have a long-term vision. You're absolutely clear where you want to be in 20 years' time. And then you move towards it in bite-sized chunks rather than trying to overthrow the current culture overnight. Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. Jolene Culbertson, I'm going to ask the first question online. Is this the right question? In its place, should it not be, is it necessary to damage the economy to avoid damaging the environment?
Oh, you're being given a...
Oh, right, sorry. People normally don't want to hear me, but they normally do. Jolene Culbertson asks, is this the right question? In its place, should it not be, is it necessary to damage the economy to avoid damaging the environment?
Yeah, I mean, I guess they're referring to the question of the sort of the title of this event around, is it justifiable to damage the economy in order to save the environment kind of thing. And I mean, I agree with the premise of this question in that these two things are interlinked. And perhaps it's again going back to that long-term thing. Yes, you can maybe see kind of short-term gains from damaging the environment in favour of protecting the economy, but long-term they are absolutely connected.
I'm going to come to you all in a moment, so do have your questions ready. Another question from Harry McLean. I mean, do you think that the government's aim to make organisations carbon zero has just been too optimistic?
No.
No, I thought that was the answer to that one.
But I mean, maybe there's something about targets as well. Like, I think it's really important to have targets that are science-based, that are based on the evidence, and then just try to work towards them. And yes, we're going to have challenges, and yes, there are going to be barriers, and yes, some targets won't be met, and yes, sometimes we'll learn different things about the barriers around the targets. I think we have to not treat targets like a kind of a bet that we want to make sure is really, really safe, because we don't want to be humiliated if we don't meet it. I think we need to have targets that make sense based on the science and the best knowledge that we have at the time, and just be open about and transparent about our progress towards them. And things will change, that's okay, but we should just keep kind of gunning for what we know.
As a sort of former public servant, I think we don't handle targets very well overall, and I think the media has something to be responsible for. We don't set stretching but achievable targets, and we pillory people who don't quite make the targets, and so targets in a way I think have fallen into disrepute. Over to you. If you could just say who you are when your hands go up in a forest, which is not currently obvious, but yeah, Louis.
How do you square up a non-growth economy with the need to still stimulate innovation and ambition? So, shall I repeat the question? How do you square up a non-growth economy with the need not to stifle individual desire to innovate, which is often based on ambition?
I mean, there's a lot of, I know a lot of ambitious people who are driven by the idea, who are driven by the thing that they can make better, who are driven, like, I went to architecture school, I was surrounded by people who wanted to make the world a better place and to make things that are beautiful and exciting. That's what they're, like, lots and lots and lots of people are individually and collectively driven by doing great stuff, by making great art, by writing great books, by what I'm optimistic that we as people like to do good, like make great things. I think it'll be fine.
Wait for the mic, I think. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Phil Richards. This might sound a naive question, and if it is, I apologise, but the challenges to post-growth or degrowth, they're quite immense in a way. How do you respond to entrenched positions, established political thought that may be seen as a barrier to change, and that some groups in society don't like change, whilst there's no boundary to human endeavour and human thought, but collectively as a society, we all want to move forward, but there are some people who are just resistant to change and because they don't like it.
You've obviously been to the House of Lords, but we won't go there.
I guess two things. One is that, rewind, 150 years and imagine how impossible it would have seemed for like a woman to go to university. A lot of people would have laughed her out the room kind of thing. But many, many people worked for social change in order to make that happen. And now it's like bloody brilliant, of course. Social change takes time. And I think we need to maintain the kind of openness to conversation about what we feel is right and what we feel is moral, and have kind conversations with each other to understand each other's positions and fears and so on around that change. But exactly as you've said, we still want to keep moving forward and we still want to make that social progress. And I think what we're talking about, no system lasts forever. And let's be proactive about emerging and designing the next system and not just let the current system collapse on our heads.
Yeah, I want to encourage us to talk a bit about the green economy as we go on, and I think the panellists would do that, because at the moment we're talking very much about how you achieve social change. But it isn't easy, and there are a lot of barriers, and partly, as you said, because people have got investment in the current arrangements, yeah. And that's how they've been conditioned. So you say you're optimistic. I can be with you on the argument. I'm not as optimistic in terms of changing the mindset of governments and people.
There are two things I hold on to. One is, so I quit smoking about 3 years ago, and the change in the number of people who used to smoke all the time, this room would have been full of smoke. Social change happens and it happens quickly, and that's just one example. The other thing I really love is, as a really great example of collective action, is when an ambulance goes down the road and it's got a siren and everyone gets out the way. Like, we do give a about each other. I really believe that we do.
It's a rare sight to see an ambulance going down the road. We won't dwell upon that one. Yeah, but smoking was influenced primarily by legislation. Actually, we changed the habits of people by legislating against smoking in public places.
Legislation has a role to play, but it's not only
I was encouraging
legislation,
you to say,
it's
yeah.
Also cultural, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Gentleman at the back and just in front.
Thank you. Simon Rawlinson. Thank you very much for your analysis, which I really enjoyed. I thought it was very penetrating. I'm going to ask perhaps a cheeky question. I think a lot of people would say that evidence shows that capitalism is the best and most effective means of allocating resources that's ever been invented. And we're in a situation where we have 27 years to get a solution to the net zero crisis. So the question is it too much of a risk to break something that might not be perfect, but is known to be good at channeling resources to a particular requirement?
One thing that the Adam Smith Institute and I agree on is that we do not have a perfectly free market. We have a very managed version of capitalism. And I think what a lot of the transition plans in terms of what's in the post-growth and degrowth scholarship, and I'm absolutely not speaking for all of them, but from what I've read and what I understand is that we're trying to make those steps in order to shift the way in which we manage the way that resources are allocated and unpick the ways in which we're incentivizing behaviors that we don't want and, yeah, results that we don't want. So I think we're already in that transition. I think it's just being, sort of having our eyes open to it.
I've got two more questions right at the back, and then I'm going to ask the panellists to come up here. So right at the back, because you were almost off the radar screen, but right at the back, yes, and then just in front of you.
It's William Waits. If I've understood you correctly, your model for funding worthy projects, if I can put it rather flippantly, was for the government to print the money first and then recover it back in taxes. I don't understand how that isn't a recipe for inflation.
So,
Or borrowing. Or borrowing?
I believe you said tax it back.
so the MMT idea is that what currently happens when a country has monetary sovereignty, so has control of its own money supply, is it is able to create money first to fund whatever it wants to fund, public infrastructure projects, whatever, and then it can tax that back second. And the important thing is that we don't have to create wealth in the private sector in order to tax it back, in order to create public shared wealth. It's exactly the same equation, it's just the other way around, but that makes it fundamentally different because then we can decide where we want to spend that money in a very, very different way. Now, runaway inflation, if you just created loads of money and you didn't tax any of it back, yeah, you'd end up with loads of money trying to kind of map against fewer and fewer resources, and that's where you'd get inflation. But some inflation isn't based on that. A lot of inflation is to do with bottlenecks and all the supply chain stuff, and we have to tackle those things directly. But you wouldn't have a sort of an endless excess supply of money by taxing it back and taxing the behaviors that you don't want in order to create that balance. That's really, really high level. There are many kind of better people who can speak about it, but look up Stephanie Kelton as a great modern monetary theory advocate.
Okay, last question from the floor for the moment. Yeah. Wait for a microphone. I should learn.
Thank you very much for emphasizing the role of GDP in all of this. For many years, it's been well recognized that GDP has a lot of flaws in it. And you will recall Nicolas Sarkozy, when he was president of France, put together a commission to review how GDP is calculated. It included Nicholas Stern from the London School of Economics. So I wonder, before you move on to including non-economic factors in the calculation or assessment of GDP, how you would correct GDP. And I'll give you just two examples. One is slightly absurd, and the other is very real. If I go around to my local shop and buy a pint of milk, I add 90 pence to GDP. If I drive around, I'll add a couple of pounds more. Better still, if I crash the car on the way back, I'll add £2,000 more. That all adds up to additional GDP. That's the absurd version. The real one is just not too far away from me, where there's a £100 million contract of recladding of buildings that were already clad. That also contributes to GDP. So is there any proposal to distinguish between beneficial growth in GDP and wasteful growth in GDP?
So there's loads of stuff on complementary currencies and different kinds of currencies that could maybe be spent on different things. I'm not going to go into it now because it's like super technical and honestly above my pay grade. But yes, there is research on like thinking about, well, should we have different currencies so that you can't trade a rainforest for a smartphone? What if we had different currencies and we could measure the sort of the growth in the things that we want to see the growth in without having to kind of being able to just trade that for growth in the undesirable things? It's interesting. It's not necessarily the only way forward, but there is a lot of research on that, and maybe, yeah, enjoy it.
I think it's unfair, Smith, to expect you to carry the whole load. So I'm going to invite,
Great, thanks.
I'm going to invite the panellists, if they can come up. Well, you take your tea and I'll go over there.
Okay.
And I should warn you in advance, I'm going to take my jacket off because it's really, really hot up here. And if it's the same down there, you may want to take yours off.
Water.
And You won't be surprised if I don't spend hours introducing you. But I'll just briefly, because your careers are just so stellar, I think it would just take too long. Vivienne King, who I know is sitting on my immediate left, is Head of Real Estate Social Impact at The Good Economy and has had leadership positions in real estate for quite a long time. I'm not going to embarrass you by using the data I've got here, but quite a long time. Vivienne, thank you for coming along. Sam Carson is the Senior Director and Head of Sustainability at CBRE's UK's Valuation Advisory Team, which probably tells people most of what they need to know for the purpose of this discussion. Dan Epstein, who came in when someone dropped out. So Dan, thank you particularly for coming along at short notice. Consultant Director of Sustainability at Useful Projects, founded Useful Projects, Head of Sustainability Development and Regeneration for the London 2012 Olympic Games, which only seems like yesterday. Pete Gladwell, good to have you, Pete. Leads L&G's investments with the public sector, including the Cabinet Office, local authorities, NHS, housing associations and universities, which now total $4.5 billion. And finally, Xaviere Roudeix Crouan, who wants to be known as Xavi, and I'm really grateful for that, because like me, you have a name which some people get wrong. Xaviere has a broad range of experience, having worked in the industry for more than 20 years, covering both the UK and European markets, and joined Knight Frank Investment Management as a partner and head of research a year or so ago. So as I say, we're really pleased to have you all here. What I said, I did warn you about this, it'd be really interesting to have your reactions to what Smith has been saying, and how you think this could impact upon the work that you're doing. Can I be really predictable, Vivienne, and start, because you're nearest?
By all means. Good evening, everybody. Great to be here, and thank you, Smith, for that thought-provoking indeed. So my perspective is very much about the social consequences for people of everything that we've been talking about. And obviously, the traditional model of evaluating real estate has really been to financialize it. That's how we enable it to grow. But the consequences of that, of course, is it's encouraged disparity, it's encouraged inequality, and we notice that most acutely in the housing market. We have a housing crisis because of affordability, and Smith referred to talking about homes, not units. In fact, Rachel Reeves spoke yesterday about housing is needed in order to create homes, because they are homes, they're not just an asset. So as an industry, it is our responsibility to be thinking about how we are creating homes and other places for people to be, to enjoy, to spend their time, as well as creating an asset. And I am optimistic, like Smith. And I suppose I'm a born optimist, but I'm partly optimistic, A, because I'm working with some amazing organisations like Pete's, like others, who are absolutely thinking in this way, as well as delivering long-term risk-adjusted returns. But also last year, I did an assessment, I carried out an exercise asking these questions of the industry. And what I discovered was that people, yes, they are getting it. There is a change in attitude towards creating social impact as well as delivering financial performance. People are actually seeing the connection between social, economic, and financial risk. But even more than that, they're actually seeing their potential for creating a better lived experience for people, in addition to delivering into the built environment. The built environment doesn't operate in the ether. It is very much grounded in its place, and the effect it has on people can be negative or positive, and therefore the choice should be positive. So I'm delighted to support Smith's optimism in this, Michael.
What do you think of the barriers?
So any number of barriers, but we've always overcome barriers. As an industry, we are traditional, but we can also be innovative in overcoming barriers. So one of the barriers in relation to social impact, which which I come across a lot, is there is no standardization. Well, there is a little bit more standardization in the context of environmental performance, but I think that's subject to dispute. In terms of social performance, there isn't standardization. I very much focus on the how. How are you going about doing it? Are you engaging good governance? Are you measuring it? Are you understanding what local needs are? And all that will be very, very different depending on the place that you're in. And you just have to accept that you are dealing with a different place and you are working to the demographics in a different place. You create a different asset for a different place. So why wouldn't you work to the local needs of it? So that's one of the barriers, Michael.
Okay, thank you. Sam.
Well, love this. And by the way, I'm another optimist, so maybe it's Thoreau. But love this discussion. It's really exciting. But what I want to look at initially is how broken is it right now? Because capitalism, as was pointed out, has been an extraordinary change enabler over when it's been trained properly. It's like an AI model. If you train it poorly, it'll give you bad results. But what can we do to train it better? And real estate, I think, has had a lack of metrics in the sustainability space for a long time. And now it's getting them. And I think that that's really, really important. When market evidence allows us to do our jobs properly, as the RICS teaches you, then suddenly we can start to see the change that we need to see happen within the markets as they exist today. And the great thing about this is that it happens now, it happens today. And in fact, right now our big problem is getting on the ground with the assessments of decarbonizing, of improving buildings, of making the buildings better today. We don't really have time. And I think that when we get to the place where we're having the discussion and we should be thinking about what the long term is for the economy, absolutely, always question the tools that we have. But we do have a tool right now which is extraordinary. It's lifted billions out of poverty. It's done all sorts of things. And right now it can do something really exciting. It can decarbonize real estate, but we have to train it. And I think that the role of the RICS is vital within that. There's a huge part of this is getting the skills on the ground so that we can get to boarded up W.H. Smiths in Middlesbrough and figure out what it needs to get back into circulation in the right way right now in a net zero state. Imagine that. And maybe give the person who's sleeping in the doorway a job. Let's figure that one out. And so I really think that I'm really worried about time here. I think we just need to get started and get cracking and really focus on that challenge. Thank you very much. Pete.
Yep, Pete Gladwell, Legal and General, currently Legal and General, but in the new model I can tell I'll be working for the Treasury, so look forward to that. Only half joking though, I think that's what's so fascinating about
Careful
this.
what you wish for.
I didn't say I wanted to. So only half, I think, the interesting thing, there's lots of things I really agreed with in Smith's talk, and, the fact that GDP has become of oversized importance to us as a nation, and that growth has to be inclusive and not extractive, I think are really important principles. I suppose for me the thing that struck me as an interesting perspective, because it kind of jarred with me, was the idea that money is somehow a ruler in this economy. Legal and General, just to pick an example, stewards £1.3 trillion of society's pensions and savings, but it's 8 million people's pensions. It's about 12 million if you take the widest definition. But my point is, we are serving, or we should be serving, if we do our job correctly, those workers who have put their pensions and savings in the likes of the LNGs, the Avivas, the etc. This, I hope it's obvious, is not about Legal and General and me promoting us. It's about a really important principle. So when we do our job correctly, we are stewarding those workers' pensions and savings and channeling their pensions and savings to improve their places and to improve the environment. My slight concern about the state creating money to do good, absolutely the state does need to fund some things. Not everything can be funded institutionally. My slight worry about the state funding good things is twofold. Firstly, it devalues financially people's workers' pensions and savings, which I don't think is something we want to see. But equally importantly, if we're not careful, takes the foot off the gas of those who should be holding us to account for doing the right thing with their pensions and savings. So if we get to a model where we say it's the state's job to fund all the great things in the economy, and you, L&G, your job is to just go out and make as much money as you can from a devaluing pound, we're in morally a very, very tricky situation. And as I say, I probably would end up working for the Treasury in that situation. So,
Do you want to respond to that point now, Smith? Because it's really quite an important point.
What about the people who don't have pensions?
well, auto-enrollment is a great invention for precisely that reason. Yeah, I think it's really important we democratise this as much as we can.
Yeah, I mean, I think within I understand and I hear that, yeah, you're serving those workers' pensions with the work that you're doing, and you're also funding lots of good things like social housing, and there's lots of like good things that are being created out of pensions investments, and I'm not sort of saying anything against that, other than that if we, that all of that relies on that investment model where it's got to sort of, it's got to make a return, and that return then necessitates additional growth. And if that sort of all adds up on aggregate, then that growth has to be sort of coupled with resource use, because we can't recycle more than 100% of everything, and because of those increasing. So it's like if you it depends where you draw the system boundary. Like if you just sort of look at one project, it could be kind of creating a net benefit. But if every single thing is trying to do that, then obviously we have net losses. And what we are seeing at the moment is a lot of net appropriation of resources, of value, and so on, from particularly the global south to the global north, but between sort of regions that and individuals that are less well off to those that are more well off. And it's just, so long as we're relying on that kind of wealth creation that then gets kind of backed up by resources, we've got a problem overall. So it's like, how do we escape the need to create that growth? How can we instead say, okay, these are all these savings, we can do this with these savings for a period of time, and then we can sort of have that return come back later, but without the sort of need for that return to be greater.
Okay.
Right.
Xaviere?
There was so much in that talk to unpack. It's kind of difficult to know where to start. I think I'll go back to the main question and ask another question, is that do we really need to have each other excluding out? I firmly believe that, in fact, we need growth to be able to finance all the things we need to do to make the planet a better place for people, for the environment. And we need that growth just because we need the financing. There's been recent studies, I mean, and the IMF has come out with eye-watering metrics in terms of how much we need to invest in the next 10 years to be able to get to that net zero planet, to that real transition. There has been other studies recently. I think that the most extraordinary one was McKinsey recently saying, well, actually, we need about, I'm going to get this wrong, but never mind, about $41 trillion US invested over the next 10 years to get to a livable planet for everyone in 2050. I think we get it wrong when we're saying we've got 25 years. We don't have 25 years, we have 10. In the sense that all the changes we're applying now to the climate system is going to take 10 years to take effect. So I mean, all the ideas presented by Smith are really interesting and really thought-provoking, and I completely agree with the fact that we need to make the system better at redistributing wealth, better redistributing all these things that can create value for everyone, nature included. But if we break the system, instead of using everything we have and throwing everything we have at the problem, we're somehow barking at the wrong tree. In terms of just the global need, so the 41 trillion is only for the sustainable side of things. If we think about the social side of things, the social equity, it's another $40 trillion US that need to be invested. So it's about 8% of global GDP per annum over the next 10 years. Where do you find that if you don't have growth? And even though, yeah, money, it seems to be a bad word tonight here, but it's what we have to use, and that's, for me, where I stand, it's as much an enabler as it is a way to make more money on the back of the wrong people or using more resources. But using, as an example, 1% more GDP growth on a global basis is about, on an incremental way, it's about 30 billion US dollars supplemental or incremental means for the states to throw money at the problems we have. Again, we're going back to the money principle, but because it's what we have. And the same way, the real estate industry is very much a growth-oriented industry in the sense that we're part of growth. We're a massive sector in the GDP growth calculations. And by the way, the GDP growth measurement is fairly new in the history of things. It's been introduced in 1934. So it's not a very old concept, and it's a concept that keeps evolving. We're adding stuff to it. We're changing the way we're measuring things. We're using other measures than GDP. It's just not just GDP on its own anymore. So there are loads of things that are coming into the equation. And I think, yeah, we need as much help as we can get at this stage. And we've only got 10 years. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's where I was starting from, really, because what you're saying, I think, is that we have a very limited amount of time to deal with the problems we've got. Is overturning entirely the current arrangements the right way of going about this? Or should we be having that as a long-term vision? Maybe we can persuade people to invest more in the things we need to do in the short term. But is overturning the system, which I think some people probably think you were saying, you may not have been, but is that the right way of going about it? Do you want to come in on that before
I mean, I recognise what Xaviere says. We need, under our current system, we need growth for all of those reasons that you set out. And I suppose what I've learned is that that growth comes with unintended negative consequences. And so how can we look at alternative ways of achieving the things that we need to achieve that don't have those negative consequences? I think that's fundamentally what it's about. And the ways in which we might do that, you could overthrow stuff, I guess, if that's what you want to do, but I don't think that that's the only way. I think the theory of change as to how we get to a sustainable economy, there are lots of different ways in which that could be achieved, and that's why I'm sort of, I guess, speaking about escaping those growth dependencies as the first step, so that at least we have the choice.
To bring it down to, I'm coming to you, to bring it down to a very practical issue, which is not actually, as many people have pointed out, climate related in many senses, but what would you have said to London's mayor 10 years ago, 5 years ago, about ULE emissions, how you should approach that? Because many people will say that the Uxbridge by-election was a sign that people are not prepared to pay money for that or to spend more for that. What would you have advised CIDIC to do?
Good scrappage scheme.
Sorry?
A good scrappage scheme so that it's affordable. I mean, it's about distribution at the end of the day. I think like you can't have a kind of a raft of environmental policies that only create a kind of an eco-elitism. Like it's got to be something that looks at making sure that it's possible for everybody to have access to the solutions. And given that we live in a very unequal society, that means certain things have to, you need grants, you need schemes, you need these things to help with that distribution.
Okay, thanks. Dan? Yeah, sorry.
I mean, I would have said to Sadiq that your policy was absolutely right. You just sold it really badly. I mean, what does ULEZ actually kind of mean? No one gets it. Actually, what we're saying is the 10% worst polluting vehicles need to be taken off the road because they're killing your kids. If you'd sold it as the tax to stop killing your kids, it might have kind of got more support.
With the scrappage scheme?
Well, the scrappage scheme, and absolutely. But I think it's a fantastic sort of provocation that you gave. I mean, I have to say that I'm really optimistic because I've been working in sustainable development for 35 years. And so I believe in some ways in our kind of ingenuity and our ability as people to kind of find solutions. But I'm really not optimistic because where this is all coming from is a sort of global crisis. It's a global crisis, not just of climate, and people say we've got 10 years of, well, actually just, the whole introduction to this talk was that we're living, middle of October, and it's record sort of temperatures. We've seen more days of over 1.5 than ever. And actually, I think the climate crisis, but particularly the sort of carbon crisis, is the easy crisis. We will find carbon solutions. I'm much more concerned about the loss of biodiversity, the loss of a functioning ecosystem that gives us our pollinating plants, that gives us our food, that gives us our, the environment that supports life. So it's not really economy versus, ecology. If we don't have ecology, we don't have economy, frankly. So that's the kind of my nervousness. What was rattling around my head from your talk the whole time was that, are we building assets or homes? Others have sort of said it, and I think I spend loads of time with lots of developers talking about capacity and asset, not homes and places. It's the role of, I would say, strategic planning to ensure that we all deliver great places, and then people can get on with the ingenuity and the sort of brilliance and the capital and all the rest of it to kind of deliver those. If what you see in Sweden, what you see in I would say in Scandinavia, is a really grown-up planning system that forces people not to inflate land value because they know the developer will then reduce 106 and not deliver the bits you really want, but they know if they're going to go and buy bits of land and build on that piece of land, they're going to have to deliver to the rules. So we have a kind of slightly chaotic sort of playing field. So I think that's a kind of a problem. I think that I was thinking, are we consumers or are we citizens? I feel more and more, in the last 35 years of working, I've become a sort of a consumer and not a citizen. I kind of value things in terms of what I consume, not in terms of what I give back to society. Are we individuals, as Galbraith said, or are we communities of people? I had an argument with somebody very close to me saying, why do I have to pay all this tax? I made all the money myself. Well, but you go to hospital every few weeks. Who paid for that? You drive around. Who pays for that? Your kids or your grandchildren got educated in the state, the state system. Who paid for that, etc. We kind of tend to forget this sort of stuff. But I think there's the really big challenge, and it's sort of the first question you were asked was, in a sense, this is a cultural problem. It's a kind of problem of values. I think it would be almost impossible if the Labour Party got up today and said, we're not going to have a no-growth society, we're going to have a fairer society, we're going to have a completely different society. I think they just would get nowhere. That's the problem. I think there's a huge education required and an unlocking of our kind of financial systems, required in order to kind of create this sort of shift. Capitalism actually is, since 1850s or what have you, and the Industrial Revolution has actually done us wonders. We live better lives, we have more access to stuff. Now, this crisis is a sort of really, really new crisis. The ecological crisis really has hit us really quickly. We are living now in an age where we realize that we have to live with the environment. It's the only planet we've got in a kind of new way. And I sort of agree that at the moment, the capitalism is just sort of shaped in the wrong way. If we need a different type of economy and a different type of finance to deliver what we need to sort of deliver, I think that's the right argument. And I think there are loads of kind of solutions out there that can give us zero carbon, cut. Why do 50% of food, end up in the bin, not on our plates, and doesn't get consumed? Why is it so expensive? Why do we have linear economies, not circular economies? Why do we rate the sort of, places like Myanmar, who no one knows about, for all the rare earths that go to China, that end up in Germany and then in America in our vehicles, but then end up in somewhere in Africa, where they all get burnt and pollute the sort of the system. This type of capitalism, which is what we've got, a linear economy, just doesn't work. So actually, I think what we kind of need is to kind of make this. I don't believe we've got time to break the system. I just think we have time, though, to completely re-engineer and rethink the systems so they actually work to give us the things that Smith was sort of arguing we kind of need. We need a clean, more equal, more renewable, more fair society, some of us don't need growth, some of us live 6-planet lifestyles, but lots of people don't live, 1-planet lifestyles, and frankly need real growth. So again, we just need to think about this in a really sophisticated way, and I don't think there's a sort of, it's one thing or the other. I think it's an incredibly complicated issue that requires huge realignment. And the first thing we need to do is take the threat seriously. We haven't taken it seriously. Until we all take the threat seriously, we won't get on board. But once we do, I believe that human ingenuity will find the solutions.
I mean, I agree with the point you were making right at the beginning of that contribution, which is that we should be as concerned about biodiversity. And I guess you would argue, if you wouldn't, I would probably argue that if your emphasis is upon developing place, then you're more likely to take biodiversity seriously in what you do. My side comment, I suppose, is that we have over the last 40 years become more and more centralized in this country. We have the most centralized system of government in the developed world. And I think that also is a pressure moving the wrong way. It's not about giving people the power to do things in their local communities that they actually would like to do if it was explained to them. It's actually being done at the centre with huge impact from the Treasury. And I've been on the receiving end of that. It's not easy to manage. And I think that's contributed to some of the problems we talked about tonight. The Labour Party say they're going to change that. Every government, before it's elected, says it's going to devolve more power, and it doesn't happen. There's a question here. I want to bring it back to really practical things for a moment, and that is a question which says, okay, what should the RICS and surveyors and the construction industry do now, immediately, to right some of these wrongs? Anyone?
Value things properly.
Yeah.
Value things properly. I mean, it's really not beyond us, actually, to kind of work out what the social value is, the environmental value, the economic value. It should just be part of what we do. Why do we value one thing over everything else?
I mean, this is very much in your territory, Sam, isn't it? Valuations. So
I saw this coming.
I have to ask you for a comment on it.
Well, I think, so I've been involved in the CBRE Valuations team for 2.5 years. And in that time, it's been like a third of my job as training, right? And so I say it comes back to skills. Because right now, if you, like 2 and 3 years ago, if our valuers were really looking at sustainability, they would be looking at BREEAM certificates and maybe bits and pieces about the engineering. But now we've really worked hard to get them to a point where they're starting to really question details around decarbonization of the buildings. And that's taken thousands upon thousands of hours of training across the floor. And everybody needs to do that because, surveyors and buildings exist within environments and societies. So if building surveyors are looking around buildings, they need to understand the sustainability aspects of a building. It's a part of everybody's job. And so the training is really, really essential. And that's really where we can't move fast enough on it. It's really urgent and it's really important that we step up training so that we have a workforce that can deliver decarbonization. I don't think we do right now. No. Even if we wanted to decarbonize all the buildings, there's no way we could resource it. It's just impossible at the moment.
Yeah. If you don't mind me saying, I think this is where both government and RICS have a role to play. We did some research with YouGov last year that shows young people are willing to pay 13% more for a zero carbon home in terms of rent. And I forget, I think it was 10 or 12% more to buy a net zero carbon home. So there's real kind of life examples of the population valuing exactly the kind of thing we're talking about. This, but it's sometimes very hard. I'm not a surveyor, so forgive me. But as I understand it, it's very hard to put those things into a cash flow sometimes. And I think that's where government intervention that says, by 2030, you won't be able to sell a house like this anymore. Is absolutely, I hope I haven't given the impression I'm kind of let the market solve it.
But we could have done that on insulation 20 years ago. It wasn't rocket science.
But also, if the government was there saying, and the point again I agree with Smith on is, some of these things do require some subsidy, and if government was saying these types of buildings will be provided with subsidy to enable the installation of heat pumps, again, that could be factored into a cash flow. you know, if you're struggling with the YouGov evidence that I find quite persuasive. But so I suppose the point I'm trying to make in this is what doesn't help, and I'm trying to remain apolitical as I make this point, is government shifting and changing things around that then mean the cash flows move around and that uncertainty gets incorporated into the cash flow. Certainty is a really
But you are
important
saying,
role.
aren't you, and if you were, I'd probably agree with you, that we haven't done enough to develop the skills in the economy, and we haven't invested enough in the commercial applications of the green economy. I mean, we are behind.
And that's what's so exciting. I mean, we're invested in heat pump manufacturers, Oxford photovoltaics. There's so much. This actually benefits employment in the UK.
Yeah.
You know, you create Northern Powerhouse Rail, you've got a young person in a deprived community in Bradford who's able to travel to Leeds for work. For me, that's good, inclusive. Now, we may end up with some GDP growth there, but that's not the aim of it. It's creating a better net zero economy.
Do we think regulation could play a bigger role in all of this? Question from the ether.
Can I just say a thing about the previous thing?
Yeah, please.
I'm going back to your there is measure in all things. I have to get it written down somewhere. Because I think it's really important that we don't, when we're measuring all things, that we're not necessarily translating them all into pounds and pence. That we are also, we are measuring well-being in the terms that make sense for well-being, that we are measuring biodiversity in the terms that make sense for biodiversity. And that those kind of bumps in value, if everything is just translated onto the balance sheet, that's just entrenching that growth dependency in that same way. So, and I think that you, as I'm not a surveyor either, I'm getting involved, as an industry can help with that measurement of all kinds of different things, all kinds of different metrics. I will talk about a UKGBC thing now. We've just started a resilience roadmap, and the first thing that we're looking at is like, how do we measure resilience? What are the different relevant metrics that we can actually use to measure the resilience of a building or a built environment?
I just want to step in, sorry, there. I think it's really fascinating. All of us actually know how to value place. Go to, if you know, the places that are next door to a great school cost 10% more. If you're next door to a great park, you pay 10% more. If you're next door to a piece of great bit of reservoir or a nice piece of countryside, you pay more. If you've got good, public transport, etc., you pay more. In a sense, we're all making those decisions, and estate agents are making those decisions all the time. The problem is that as those properties go up in price, they become less and less affordable. And so the conundrum here we have is, how do we deliver great places that we all recognise are great, but for everybody? You know, how do we actually, that, I think, I do think at the heart of all of this, that we take so much value out of the land. It's not the developer, and I don't think it's the builder where the real value sort of goes. I think it's in the land value. I think we don't really build into that land value the opportunity to create, you know, to put investment into those, into really good places. We know what sustainable places are, because I think so much of that money's sort of been taken out beforehand, but we all know what a great place actually feels like. We all go to them all the time. We kind of go on holiday. None of us go to a sort of, you know, the dumps for holiday. We go to the places that we kind of love. You know, in a sense, we kind of know, most of us. And I remember taking my son, it was really funny, he was about 8, and I took him from Hackney, where I live, over to West London. And he was going, "Dad, is this a rich place?" And literally, this little boy looking off the back of my bike, saying, "Yeah, is this a rich?" I said, "Why would you ask me that?" He said, "It's because it's so green." And sort of an 8-year-old has recognised, actually, that somehow we're in a better, different, you know, less urban, less grungy, greener, more lovely sort of space. If an 8-year-old can get it, I think we all get it. So I don't think we kind of don't know what it is or how to value it. I just think it's a question of the economic system doesn't, you know, and the affordability really play against all of this. It's really challenging. I don't know how to deal with it, though.
Well, it's the difference between valuing something and extracting value from it.
Yeah.
And it's the way in which we apply value to it. So I don't actually think that we can monetize the difference between a place that's next to a green park or next to the sea or whatever it might be. We can't do that. It just doesn't work. You know, once upon a time, we tried to put monetary value on public realm. You can't do that. You simply know that instinctively there is going to be a correlation between the value. But we're doing it because we're actually creating a better place, and a better place for everyone in a community is actually a better better place for that asset, because that's where people want to be. Yeah. They want to work there, or they want to live there, and they want to spend leisure time there. We know that, and we simply have to trust the fact that there is an instinctive improvement in that place, even if we can't put a pound sign on it. Yeah. That's how we need to move this industry forward.
Yeah, I agree with that, but it's been going on a long time, hasn't it? I mean, you know, when I was a local government official responsible for development schemes within boroughs, some in London, some outside, you always started out with a scheme which included green open spaces. And then the costs went, and the government said, no, you've got to cut back. And what's the first thing you cut back? You cut back the green open spaces. And there are parts of London, you know, where that's visible, as you said, visible now, big time.
I actually think that the economy is at a turning point, and I think the industry is a turning point at the same time. I don't think that social impact has ever been as centre stage for this industry as it is now. I think there are any number of drivers for that. I actually think COVID, Brexit, I think the cost of living crisis has all made us look at ourselves and question whether or not we're actually being responsible stewards of our capital. And those things are creating changes. Institutions are demanding more from asset managers. Consumers are demanding more. Peter's been talking about how people are concerned about how their pension money is actually being invested. This wasn't happening before, this sense of responsible investment. This is new, and it's an opportunity for us to capture it in order to create better value.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I said when I did the review of the RICS was the RICS and its members had not taken any of this seriously enough, that actually the public debate should have the RICS front and centre, and it's been missing, despite the fact that 60% of carbon emissions come from the built environment. There's a real challenge there. Roudeix is nodding. That's the start. do people in the profession agree with that? What more could we do in the short term to show that we are now taking this seriously? Microphone.
Stephen Hill. I just wanted to go back to your point about practicalities. So today we had Keir Starmer announcing that Labour are going to relaunch Newtown programme. And if you think about the time it's going to take for those to be infrastructured, built, occupied, stewarded, we're talking about places that are going to be occupied in the 2030s, 2040s, 2050s, when life will be very different. So we can't possibly do what we did before. So maybe the panellists could say, how would we do it differently this time? And if the answer is rather complicated, which it probably is, would it be a good idea for the RICS to set up a public interest task force that with others, UK Green Building Council and others, to work with government and other investors of all kinds to work out how to do it and then get on and do it?
Well, let's ask the panellists. We've not got much time left. All I would say, in answer to the point, not in answer, but in commenting on the point you made, if this isn't the moment for the RICS to step up to the plate on this issue, with the potential for a change of government which is making this an absolute priority, what is the RICS about? Go on. Yeah, you were nodding enthusiastically. Okay. I was waiting. I just didn't want to assume. I was waiting for the words.
Other panellists are available. So, I mean, for me, this is an absolutely brilliant example, because I don't think the right solution is modern monetary theory, where we issue so much new money that we can fund 5 new towns. You know, this is a great example of where existing capital within society can be put to better use. The type of capital is what's incredibly important. I think what Labour are signalling quite clearly is they want to move away from a model where housing estates are built by a developer who's seeking to maximise profit, extract as much as possible, have a short-term return on capital model that's very capital constrained, so they'll just build a house as quickly as they can sell it. But again, Smith said, you know, it's not necessarily wrong, and I'm certainly not insulting any individuals. That's just a model. 2, a much more collaborative approach, and I totally agree with what Dan was saying, where the state is clearly strategizing about where these places should be built, and a combination of state strategy. I'd suggest some kind of development corporations funded by much longer term finance that can take a forward-looking view to put in the transport infrastructure and the social infrastructure that's paid back by land value capture and long-term cash flows that come from the assets and towns that are created. I've done the modelling. My team has done the modelling. It's perfectly deliverable, but it's a very different type of capital from the current capital that we're relying upon to deliver our housing supply.
Thanks very much, Pete. Dan?
Stephen always asks really good questions and really difficult questions. And actually, I completely agree. I think, in a way, what we need to do differently. I'm going to go to the Olympic Park quickly. I think it was a bit of a mistake that the government built the whole thing, and not a mistake. I don't think it was an accident. Sorry, in the sense that the investors had to pull out because we had in 2008, the great global financial crisis, and the government sort of stepped in and sort of built the village and built the what have you. But in the end, it cost 12 billion or something. But the year after, the Treasury did a piece of work to look at the value it created, and they said it was 13 billion, in value, and that wasn't in real estate value, that was in place value, that was in tourism, that was in health value, that was in all the other values. The only people who can kind of look at all those values is in a way the state, because otherwise, the value of providing great health and getting the benefits of having less people go to the hospital goes back to the NHS. The values of having great public transport and having people on the roads and less accidents, etc., go to the go back to the government. So in some ways, they need to have that view. I think they just need to provide real certainty. I think they should have some sort of control, and then they should let developers get on, but around really good place guidance. I think it should be really sort of clear. They should be able to make profit, but not ridiculous profit. You won't get anybody kind of working with that. They should have very clear requirements around what they kind of build. I think EP and people like that used to sort of try to do that.
And it's still happening, isn't it? I mean,
It's
2 weeks'
sort of
time,
happening, yeah.
2 weeks' time, I'm going to the opening of the new London College of Fashion on the knowledge sector there. I mean, this is still bringing value to the community and to the country.
And it sort of demonstrates that you can have a different type of partnership, different sorts of money. You can leverage all sorts of different money in to deliver the thing, but you've got to decide what it is you want to deliver. And that should be sustainable.
Well, I've just got to deliver time and end. So I'm going to do that in a minute, but please, those who haven't contributed to this last section, anything you want to add? And Smith, is there anything you want to add to?
What I'm thinking about is that point about how do we make collective decisions about what to do with our resources. And some of the points that you were raising there, Dan, about we could do very sensible things for not killing our kids, for example, and it's very difficult to achieve because money kind of gets siloed off into different places and somebody makes a profit and somebody else, And I think we could do more to develop that cultural apparatus. And the other thing I wanted to say was there was a question about what can surveyors and sort of surveying businesses, practices, organisations do at the moment. And I think one thing that's really important is talking to each other. There is an incredible amount of capacity, creativity, interest kind of throughout your organisations, at all levels of your organisations as well. And I think some of these points around having more kind of democratic and inclusive conversations about what organisations are doing collectively. There will be loads of people, all of your colleagues, loads of people have brilliant ideas, and I think we have to open up that conversation more and talk about these kinds of things more, saying let's get all the tools out and really have a good conversation about them.
Can I come in on that? Sorry, will you?
Go
on. So I love this idea because I think that real estate hasn't really thought about sustainability properly yet. And there's so much innovation that I think is just ready to go. As soon as you get sustainability experts in the room with property professionals who are top of their game, and they go, well, let's sort it. Let's get it sorted. Let's fix it. And let's come up with new solutions. And I don't think that that's happened enough yet, right? I don't even think we're even close. That innovation is still siloed. And when we break those silos, when we integrate these teams, I just think it's going to be really exciting about what we can come up with. I think there's a reason for optimism.
I'm not being rude, but I was about to talk about silos and say it's almost a cliche, but you're absolutely right. I mean, some of the solutions to these very complex problems are interconnected solutions, and yet we have become, I know you can generalise too easily, we've become a society where people sit in their silo and they do not talk or interact across the boundaries.
And the solutions are small, lots of small solutions, not massive ones. And I think the other problem is that we often look to the big things rather than lots of the incremental little things that really
in places,
Yeah.
in places,
Yeah.
rather than
Small things
always
can
at the
be
centre.
radical.
And those who are stewards of places, naturally local authorities, of course, are particularly at fault in this context. In fact, they're not only in silos, but they can actually be in competition with each other, so that you actually find one negative being created by a positive somewhere else. So that is a major problem. But I suppose I just picking up on the need for a strategic approach to identifying what should be happening in place. We mustn't forget that those who understand place best are those who inhabit place, who live in a place, who have lived in a place, and they have to be included in the conversation. We talk about democratic conversations within organisations. Yes, we need democratic conversations happening outside a place as well. Only in that way will we be more secure in creating a place that's going to be successful for everybody than not.
But if you're going to have those conversations taking place, then people need to be convinced that there's some purpose in being involved in that conversation.
Yes.
And if you
They
draw
have to
all the
trust.
power away from places and communities to the centre, they don't think
No.
there's any purpose
No.
to this. Sorry, you're taking me down my particular hobby horse. Last points. Anyone from the panel who wants to make a last point? Shadi, you all right?
Just one last thing. I feel like we've been battering the industry quite a lot, saying we haven't been doing enough and we haven't made any progress, when I think a lot has happened. When I started in the industry, we were only talking about financials. And through the years, we started talking about placemaking, talking about social engagement, starting talking about sustainability, and everything is happening very quickly. At least over the past 5 years, there's been an incredible change in the business. More could be done, that's for sure. The tools we have at the moment are not perfect, but they are getting better. I think, as a basis of all that, we need more data. I'm going to come back to data because that's what we have to work with. But if we have more data, we can price risk better. We can know how to make a better distribution of where we need the things to go, and including all the social value and all the sustainability considerations is just common sense.
I'm sure that's right. But as a critical, I hope, constructive friend of the RICS and the profession, I have to say, and I said in the report I did, that actually RICS has not been involved sufficiently in public interest debates, and this is a public interest debate, so it has time. It's got to make up quite a lot of time, and that needs, I think, real investment of time and effort, creativity in the next 2 years to pick up many of the issues that we talked about tonight. I think anyone who leaves tonight not thinking about these issues has either been asleep or probably should retire entirely. I think it's been a fascinating contribution. We haven't come to conclusions. Who on earth would have expected it? But I would like to, and I'm sure you'd like to, thank the panellists and not least Smith for fantastic contributions. Thank you.